This video is all about the chemical and physical requirements that bacteria need in order to grow. When we say that bacteria are growing, we don't mean that they are physically getting larger in size. We're referring to the number of cells present in the population. Okay, so what do bacteria need in order to replicate? So we can divide the different requirements needed for life into two broad categories: physical factors or physical requirements, and then chemical requirements. And that's really just the nutrients that the organisms need. So for chemical factors, we're thinking about chemical elements. What do they need carbons and hydrogens and oxygen atoms for? Okay, so first we're going to talk about pH, temperature, tonicity, and then we're going to move into oxygen requirements. But here's where it gets a little confusing. We're going to talk about how organisms use oxygen to build the molecules that they need to survive. So that's a chemical requirement or a nutritional factor. But we can also talk about oxygen in the atmosphere or the lack of oxygen in the atmosphere. So in that case, I'm talking about it as a physical factor because it's part of the physical environment, just like temperature, pH, and tonicity is talking about the physical environment. Okay, so know that when we say oxygen, you have to think about the context. Is it the element and how it's being used to build proteins and things? Or are we talking about the presence or absence of oxygen in the physical environment? Okay, let's talk about temperature first. So organisms can be classified based on the temperature range at which they can grow, including their optimal temperature. So you will want to remember the 4 categories or classifications shown here. You'll want to know the minimum temperature they can grow at, the maximum temperature they can grow at, and their optimal temperature. So our mesophiles are kind of in the middle. Okay, they grow best at our body temperature. So most of the human pathogens are going to also fall into this category because their optimal growth temperature is the same as ours. If you look to the right, moving to the higher temperatures are the thermophiles. So thermo means heat. So these organisms love warmer temperatures. And so you can see their growth range is at about 42 degrees to about 80 degrees Celsius, with an optimal temperature closer to 70 degrees Celsius. If you look at the category to the far right, hyperthermophiles, hyper means excess, right? Like if you're hyper, you have a lot or excess energy. So a hyperthermophile needs extreme heat. Okay, so you can see the growth range there. And notice that they have the highest growth rate near 100 degrees Celsius. That's really pretty hot. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the cold-loving organisms are psychrophiles, with their growth range between about -5 degrees Celsius to 20 degrees Celsius, with an optimum temperature of 10 degrees Celsius. Now, you're going to want to make sure you can keep these straight. So thermo is your hint that you're looking at the higher temperatures. And being a Texas girl myself who moved to Indiana for graduate school, I quickly realized I was not cut out for the cold. So I remember the cold organisms as psychro because you're psycho if you love the cold. And I'm kidding, like I'm not trying to offend anybody. It's just a way that I always remembered it. But make sure, again, you know the growth ranges and the optimal temperatures. But I want you to think about why do organisms grow best at these temperatures? Well, it has to do with what we talked about last week with enzymes. Remember how enzymes had an optimal temperature range as well. They had a minimum and a maximum temperature. And so those temperatures are going to correspond to the overall temperature the organism best survives at. Because remember, enzymes are specialized proteins that keep the cell functional. So the organism is going to survive best at the same temperatures that its enzymes operate best, right? Because the two are dependent on each other. All right, so let's think about an application in our everyday life. So if you go out to eat, or if you make something at home and you're going to save it as leftovers, what should you do with your food? Put it in the refrigerator. Because remember, a lot of the human pathogens have an optimal growth rate at our body temperature, about 37 degrees Celsius. But if you put your food in the refrigerator where it's much cooler, those organisms cannot grow very quickly. Now, they will not die in the refrigerator, but their growth time is significantly slowed down. Okay, so your food will be good in your refrigerator normally for a couple of days. Now, of course, if you leave it in there for a month, like what happens? You're going to start seeing mold and other things growing because, again, things are still alive in the refrigerator at those cold temperatures. They just can't grow as quickly. Now, if you store something in the freezer, you've drastically decreased how quickly things can grow. And so you can normally store things in the freezer for much longer times. So if you look at the picture on the right, we should be thinking in Celsius. Towards the 0 on the thermometer, you'll notice that's about where the refrigerator is. Normally, it's about 4 degrees Celsius. And then in the freezing temperatures that you see below 0, no significant growth occurs. They're just stagnant. Okay, so that's why you don't want to leave your food out overnight, especially dairy, because we have organisms on our hands, right? So do the people preparing your food, so do the utensils that were sitting on the table that touched your food. All of these things are introducing organisms to your food that grow at room temperature. So if you just leave your food on the counter, all of those organisms are going to be replicating overnight, and you're going to have some pretty high amounts of bacteria, molds, fungus, whatever it may be, by the time you eat it in the next day or two. And that's where food poisoning can come around. So just something to keep in mind, it's always best to refrigerate any leftover foods that have been handled by humans. Okay, the next physical growth factor or physical growth requirement is pH. So remember on our pH scale, right? We have our little pH scale. Okay, so we have the low pHs, high pH, and in the middle. So remember, our low pHs are acids, and our high pHs are bases, also called alkalines. I'm just going to abbreviate ALK there, alkalines. And 7 is a neutral pH. So organisms that grow best at low pH are acidophiles. Organisms that grow best at a neutral pH are neutrophiles. And organisms that grow best at a high pH are alkalophiles. Okay, so just remember, phile means loving. So the first part of the word is telling you what pH they grow best at. And again, the pH that an organism grows best at is going to align with the pH that those enzymes and things need in order to function. Because again, without functional enzymes, the organism cannot survive. So make sure you understand how the overall well-being of the organism in terms of its temperature, pH, and kind of growth requirements corresponds to other things we've learned about. We're starting to kind of connect the dots. Well, why do we care about enzyme structure? Well, that's what makes them functional. But the environment that they're in dictates if they remain functional or become denatured, which affects the survival of the organism. All right, the last physical factor that we're going to talk about in this video is tonicity. So remember, we talked about tonicity in terms of solute concentrations. So remember, we drew a picture, kind of like this. We said if there's more solute, like salt, outside the cell compared to inside, where's the water going to go? It's going to rush out, right? This was a hypertonic solution, which they're showing you a prettier picture at the bottom middle there. But remember, with hypertonic solutions, water is going to rush out of the cell. And notice what's happening to the inside of the cell. Do you see how the inside of the cell is starting to kind of shrivel? And that's what's happening. The technical term is called plasmolysis. And the cell membrane is detaching from the cell wall. So it is decreasing the internal surface area of the organism, which will normally lead to cell death. So this hypertonic solution that I'm showing you here, this could be a salt solution, which is typically what we think about in this class in terms of tonicity and organisms that need a high solute concentration to live. We'll be talking about things that thrive in high salty environments. So those organisms are halophiles, but organisms that don't actually use salt to grow, but they can live in the presence of salt, are haloduric organisms. And so we're going to talk about some important organisms that can live in the presence of salt, and those are going to be our staphylococci. I'm just going to write these off to the side here. Staphylococci, or coccus, I'll say, because that's the actual genus. I'm going to underline it because that's the genus of organisms, Staphylococcus. And there's quite a few that we're going to talk about when we get to the disease chapters. And one reason they're such a threat is they can live on the surface of our skin where it is dry and salty, right? Because we sweat. So there are, of course, the other two solute concentration scenarios, the isotonic and the hypotonic. But for this class, we're typically going to talk about the hypertonic solution with respect to salt. All right, y'all, that is the end of this video.